So this week we're going to talk about the struggle for civil rights, and I do want to say that this is overlapping with what we talked about in the last module, which was the Cold War. So this is all just kind of happening simultaneously. So I think that's important to kind of think about contextually as we're learning this. All right, and so speaking about the Cold War, one thing that the United States has got, in the back of its mind really as a country is the fact that we are fighting the Cold War. And so the world is looking at the United States, right? We're between the Soviet Union and the United States. These are the two superpowers that come out of World War II. And so a lot of people look to the United States and see that America doesn't look quite as perfect as it wants to look because we're really tarnished by what's happening in the racial turmoil that's happening in the United States at the time. So, and this also happens because of the decolonization that's occurring post-World War II. And so America is very criticized for for the racial tension that's going on in the country during this time period. So just to kind of put it in perspective, civil rights in the 1940s and 50s, things were still separate, but of course not equal. That comes from Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896. Facilities are segregated. They're either done by something called de facto, which is just by tradition. So they've always just kept things separate. There's nothing in the books, in the law, that says it has to be segregated, but that's the way that it is. Or, a legal segregation, and that's de jure. And so, it was kind of customary for hotels, colleges, things like that to be completely separate, restaurants, suburban housing, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. And 40% of all the schools nationwide, student-wide, north and south, kids were attending segregated schools. And so that kind of gives you a picture, even beaches, pools, everywhere, public spots during that time period. Well, in the 1940s and 50s, though, we start to see some changes, and this really comes about a lot because of the war. So the first thing that happens, of course, is that FDR, during World War II, desegregates military industries. Now, that's an important distinction. It's not the service. Military during World War II is still segregated. Our first desegregated conflict was, where we had all the troops, was the Korean War. But what he does desegregate is the defense industry. So the places that build the planes, the Boeings, Lockheed, places like that, those were supposed to be free of discrimination and desegregated. And that was, to meet the war aims, the war production aims. In 1947, of course, Jackie Robinson paves the way for integration in professional sports when he becomes part of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And if you're interested in that, interested in sports history, if you haven't seen the movie 42 about Jackie Robinson, fantastic movie. Truman himself, he really does try to implement some things, but unfortunately, Congress wasn't going for that change. He does, however, officially desegregate the military, and that's significant in 1948. So that was significant, and again, it is what really causes the conflict in 1950, the Korean War, to be desegregated, was because Truman passes that. So that was a very significant moment for civil rights. Now, if we back up just a little bit, the NAACP was formed in 1909, and the very first thing the NAACP does to try to get rid of segregation and have equal rights and really live the 14th and 15th Amendment that was given to them during the 1870s was they tried to go through Congress, they tried to plead to different presidents, and they really weren't getting anywhere. And so what they do next is they kind of launch this legal attack on segregation. And so leading this was a really young lawyer, a man named Thurgood Marshall, who will eventually become our first Black Supreme Court justice. And so, he'll be significant later on. But he starts to battle segregation in the schools. And he does this, he goes all around the South and tries to find cases. And eventually does get to, his cases, most significantly Brown versus Board of Education, to a willing court, Supreme Court. So that was important too. Earl Warren, and those of you that went to Northside High Schools, Warren High School is named after him. he very much opposed racial inequalities, and so his court passes groundbreaking cases during this time, and so it becomes known as like the Warren Court. Okay. So the most significant case, arguably in the 20th century, was Brown versus Board of Education. So this was Thurgood Marshall's, big appeal to the attack of separate but equal that was passed in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. In a huge victory for civil rights, the court overturns Plessy versus Ferguson and rules in favor of Brown, and it calls on schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed. So I'm going to say here that you might want to pause the video and watch the other video that's on here about Thurgood Marshall and Brown versus Board of Education, because it's going to provide quite a bit of insight into him as a person. So obviously the South is not going to react in a positive manner to this. They weren't like, well, okay, the law's been passed, so let's desegregate. So this is significant because if we think about that more in modern times, recently one of the most recent court cases in the United States Supreme Court was the legalization of gay marriage. And as you know, the South didn't react very well to that, right? They weren't ready to do that. They weren't really accepting it, and including Texas. So this shouldn't come as a surprise to you that the South is reacting this way. They react in a very, very negative manner. The KKK, there's a surge in attendance or in membership into the KKK. This is another time of revival. In 1956, very significantly, the representatives from the South, governors, congressional, Senate, House of Representatives members, create and sign something known as the Southern Manifesto, which is basically them saying that the court had no right to do that. They were refusing to allow that to happen. And Southern states are going to start to do things to block the desegregation of schools. This becomes a massive clash between federal and state power. And just to kind of illustrate it, this guy up to the right, charming, I'm being sarcastic, obviously, George Wallace, he famously said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So that was George Wallace. And we'll talk about him when we start talking about Selma too. Okay, so one of the biggest cases during this time period is the Little Rock 9 event. So this happens in 1957. And something to kind of keep in mind is that there were NAACP chapters all over the United States, right? So it wasn't just headquartered, I think, in Georgia at that time. But what happens is that the NAACP chapter has to find students to attend this experiment of desegregation into Central High School. So they vet all kinds of students, and there is not only an intelligence exam, but a psychological exam, because they were well aware that the children were going to go through quite a bit of trauma. And so what happens in this is that they pick 9 students to attend, and they were supposed to start school in the fall of 1957, but Orville Faubus, a horribly racist governor of Arkansas at the time, uses the Arkansas National Guard to block the entrance of these students into Central High School. And so this picture in particular is a very, very famous picture. This is on the cover of my, of the page in Canvas. But this is Elizabeth Eckford, and she was one of the Little Rock 9. She kind of gets separated from the other students. And so that's a very, very famous picture that really illustrates what had happened to them, right? So exactly what does happen is they try to get in, they can't because the Arkansas National Guard is blocking them. So in response to that, President Eisenhower sends federal troops, the 101st Airborne, to literally protect, not only walk the students into school the next day, but also to protect them the entire year. So they stayed the entire school year with these students. And so there's a really, really great video clip that you should maybe pause here in just a moment and watch. And it's about Ernest Green and his experience with the Little Rock 9. And so and he talks about Elizabeth Eckford and his experience. And I can't illustrate it any better than he really will. So I encourage you to pause it and maybe watch that clip there. So the next big event that we're going to talk about is the Montgomery bus boycott. And this one, there's a little misunderstanding, kind of myth about Rosa Parks, and that is that she was, just a tired seamstress and just decided off the cuff not to give up her seat. And that's not true. She was actually a very active member in the local NAACP chapter, and this was pretty well planned that this was going to happen at some point. Whether or not Rosa Parks was the person they were going to use, or not, kind of not completely clear on that. But I will tell you what happens is that Rosa Parks actually sits in the black section of the bus that day. And the rule in Montgomery, Alabama was that if all the seats were given up, or all the seats were taken, and a white person wants to take a black person's seat, even if it's in the black section, they can, by law, have the black person move. And that is what Rosa Parks violates. A white woman told her she wanted her seat, and she refused to give up her seat in the black section of the bus. And this gets her arrested, which launches the huge NAACP legal challenge, a bus boycott. And Martin Luther King, a young minister who's part of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, he was not an active member in the NAACP. He was actually part of the SCLC. So he comes out there to help launch this Montgomery bus boycott, and it's a boycott for 1 year where African Americans, nonviolent, refuse to ride on the buses. And so finally, after a year, the people in Montgomery County finally acquiesce, mainly because African Americans were the ones who were really their customers on these buses. And so it was significant to them where they weren't able to make any money. So they finally do desegregate the next year, so they win that. Okay, so the next big thing that really happens, and this is significant because this really starts the 1960s activism of the civil rights movement, are the sit-ins. So probably one of the best illustrated are the lunch counter sit-ins. And this really starts with 4 college students one day who go to Woolworth, and they, it's segregated, and they sit in the white section, and they sit there and wait to be served. And the waitress never serves them. They sit there from like 8 a.m. till it closes at 5 p.m. And they continue to do that for months. And, they're not the same ones that go. The original 4 are the ones that go at first, but then it becomes where people are doing it all over the country. And it goes beyond just lunch counter sit-ins. It goes to read-ins, swim-ins, like everywhere, all these places where it was segregated. So these similar sit-ins happen all over the United States. This really signifies, not only does it signify like the beginning of the 1960s activism, but it signifies the student movement. And I cannot emphasize the importance of the student movement in civil rights movement enough. So this becomes like a really big deal where students start to become active in the civil rights movement. Okay, another way that students become very active is something called the Freedom Rides. And there is another video clip here with this one for you to watch if you're interested in this. But this was essentially started with SNCC and CORE. So SNCC stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was a student group, integrated black and white, and also CORE, Congress for Racial Equality, that actually begins in the 1940s. And what happens is there was a Supreme Court law, or Supreme Court ruling, that essentially said that interstate buses travel had to be desegregated. So that interstate means when it crosses state boundaries. And so to test this law, students rode on 2 buses from Washington, D.C., and the game plan was to make it to New Orleans. They don't make it there. Massive, because it was black and white people going to the bathrooms together, eating together, and they were really kind of stirring things up, making these stops in the South. So major violence occurs for the people that are part of this. One of the buses was firebombed. President Kennedy finally does intervene, and the government does order these buses to desegregate. So this gets quite a bit of attention too. There's a clip for you to watch on that one also. Also, 1963, in the spring of 1963, Birmingham, Alabama gets quite a bit of attention. This becomes like the hotbed for civil rights activity. So in the spring of 1963, all kinds of protests are happening. Martin Luther King is down in Birmingham. This is where he's arrested, and he sits in jail for 13 days and writes Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Very famous. There was a police chief in Birmingham named Bull Connor. he was a jerk, and he used, police dogs and the fire department. And then here's, some of these pictures here, if I'm not covering it here, where they would use the fire department to hose down protesters or dogs to fight off protesters. And so used all of these means. Now, keep in mind that televisions are now a thing, and people are watching these images on their television and they're horrified. It brings all kinds of national attention, and it forces Kennedy to really step up and take a look at what was happening and take a stance on civil rights. Now, for sure, Kennedy was pro-civil rights, but his real big focus was Cold War, okay? And so this really kind of forces him to do that. Okay, also in August of 1963, the March on Washington. So another misconception about this march is that it was a march for desegregation, and it was not. It was about economic equality for African Americans. So this was significant because it was a whole conglomerate of groups, the SCLC, NAACP, and SNCC, all kind of coming together to organize this massive, largest march in history, 250,000 peaceful protesters. And this is, of course, where Martin Luther King delivers his very famous I Have a Dream speech. Okay, so at the fall of 1963 is when Kennedy is assassinated, and so President Johnson is going to take over as president. Okay, so Kennedy already had the civil rights, movement or bill going, but Johnson is the one that makes this a reality when he becomes president, and that's the next thing that's up, and this is super significant. So I want you to think about the fact that there was a minor 1957 Civil Rights Act that had passed, but this is the biggest civil rights bill. Really, it's been almost 100 years since the Civil Rights Act was passed. And so this is super significant because it bans segregation in all public spaces. Okay, it forces schools to desegregate. It allows the Justice Department to enforce and prosecute, and it establishes the EEOC that is still around today. Okay, so this is a pretty significant thing that happens. So the next thing, though, up on the plate for a lot of the civil rights people are voting rights. Okay, so it's great that things have been desegregated, but there's still not equity in voting. By that time, by like 1940-ish, only 3% of eligible voters in the South were actually registered. And so the next big event is the Freedom Summer, and there's also a clip on this. So in 1964, hundreds of college students from SNCC go down to Mississippi, and their main focus was to get a voting drive going. And so they would go from house to house and get people registered to vote, take them to and escort them, educate them on their right to vote, on all kinds of things like this. Okay, so this becomes like a complete hotbed of violence. 3 civil rights workers are killed by the KKK. This is where the FBI, there was a massive launch investigation, and they were eventually discovered in a ditch, killed by the KKK. So there's another clip on this. There's lots of good clips this week on this, but anyway, so another big event. Okay, 1965, Martin Luther King launches a big voting drive, because again, this is going to be the big focus now that the Civil Rights Act was passed. And so if you guys haven't seen the movie Selma, you guys are really missing out. You need to see this. There's actually a clip of the first Selma march from the movie Selma on the module here. So I encourage you to watch it. That's a really good clip. It's pretty graphic. But George Wallace, remember our buddy, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Well, he is going to try to block a peaceful march from Selma to Montgomery in an effort to get people to vote, right? So there's a big voting march. And actually, MLK did not take part in the first march. He'll take part in the second successful march. The one leading this was actually John Lewis, who you may or may not know died recently, a huge civil rights leader. But in response to this, if you watch the clip, you'll really understand. People watch this on their television and they cannot believe that the police in Alabama are literally beating peaceful protesters who are only trying to cross a bridge. I mean, some of them are beaten to death. Many are beaten, to the point of hospitalization, including John Lewis. And after this occurs, it kind of forces Johnson's hand, and they pushed through the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which eliminated the literacy test. That was enormous, right? The 24th Amendment was also put in place, which outlawed poll taxes, which was a tax on voting. And so Selma, big reaction in the Voting Rights Act to this. Okay, so 1965 itself becomes significant because there was, progress in civil rights desegregation. There was progress in voting rights, but there was still a lot of issues in the United States with economic inequalities, mainly because at this time period, white flight had occurred. So people that were, because of the baby boom that happens post-World War II, white families have moved out of the city center into suburbia, and so they go into these suburbs all surrounding the major cities, and they have covenants in their homeowners policies that say that they can't sell their houses to black people. So it keeps their suburbs white and separate. And so what occurs then is that ghettos begin to develop within the inner cities. And nobody's taking care of the minority families and the minorities in the ghettos. They're focused on the suburbs and the outside, and there's all kinds of restrictions. They can't get out of it. And so there's a lot of frustration within the civil rights movement that begins to happen in the mid-1960s. We start to see ghetto uprisings in Harlem, all across the United States, right? In Detroit and New Jersey. And so this is when we start to see like the frustration and the movement become much more militant. So in 1968, LBJ has an independent organization look into why are these ghetto uprisings happening, and a Kerner report came out in 1968, essentially blames the violence on the extended poverty of a lot of the African American communities, as well as continued white racism that was still prevalent, even with all of those things passed. And so this leads into one of the most significant people within the civil rights movement, who is Malcolm X. Okay, so there's a really great biography on Malcolm X that I encourage you to look at. I think he's one of the most misunderstood people in American history, but he's got a lot of background. He was in jail quite a few times, grew up pretty rough. His dad, though, was a follower of Marcus Garvey, who is a black separatist in the 1920s. And so this really shapes a lot of, Malcolm's thinking. And Malcolm's dad is actually murdered, and so, by white supremacists. So that also shapes him. He changes his name from Malcolm Little, and he takes it out because, if you may or may not know, the way that African Americans got their names early on was from their plantation owner. And so he removes the Little to get rid of his plantation owner name and calls himself X. He becomes much more militant response. He wanted black control over their community economically and politically, black separatist. He becomes in jail he meets, the Nation of Islam leader. And so he becomes like their main spokesperson. And but then there was a split in 1964 between him and the leaders of the Nation of Islam, and he himself makes a pilgrimage to Mecca, which, if you don't know much about the Muslim religion, that is one of their 5 pillars. And so he makes a pilgrimage to Mecca, and he goes there and he realizes that there's a lot of interracial harmony between people in the world. And so he comes back, with this different ideology, right? And he starts to embrace the idea of interracial cooperation in the United States. And he is separated from the Nation of Islam by this point and founds his own organization. And what this leads to is his assassination by 3 members of the Nation of Islam. And so as sad as that is, and he dies in 1965. He doesn't have a long career in the civil rights, but it's impactful, his time here and during the civil rights movement. He really becomes like, even though he doesn't live to see, the Black Panthers organization form. He becomes their unofficial Black Power father. And so this was actually led by SNCC, which stands for Students for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC actually really dissolves mostly. Stokely Carmichael was the leader, and that's him up here. And they become much more militant at this time, really tired of the slow pace of economic inequalities in the African American community, and the fact to fail to protect the civil rights that they were supposed to receive are still, you know, really it takes to the late 1970s for the African Americans really to realize even all of the same equality, or it, you know, arguably not even still today, because one of the big issues that the Black Panthers had was on police brutality, which, as I know you know, is still a major issue within the Black community. But they organized in Oakland, California in 1966. And one thing not known about the Black Panthers, yes, they were militant, that is true, but they also provide services that were not cared for the Black community. So clinics, schools, children breakfast programs. So they provided, like, you know, just basic services for the Black community during that time. They're also the ones that kind of encourage Black pride and the use of, get away from the term Negro and use the term African American. And so, you know, this is kind of where we will end when we talk about the civil rights movement. There's quite a bit that I wish I could go into, had time to go into more detail on. But I do encourage you to watch all those video clips too. It will give you a lot of great insight. So I hope you've learned a lot, and I hope you have a great week.